Hello, I'm Dr. David Santos. This is our last video on the series on medieval pagan myths and religion. Covered a lot of stuff over the last several 20 something weeks. And we're going to end by looking at giants, final battles, and suppression of mythic rituals of power and then the endings. So what we're really moving into is the medieval understanding of eschatology, and from the Greek eschaton, meaning last things, moving into seeing how the medieval world understood the end of things, final battles, and how their ancient mythology, coming from the ancient world and European world, into the classical, and then finally making its way after it's been blended with Greek and Roman and with the European ideas and all kind of smashed up, and coming then Christianity coming in and seeing how those pagan things were adapted to have this new understanding. So today we're going to take a journey into the mythic and ritual imagination of the medieval world. It's a world where giants walked, heroes battled beasts, and the end of the world was a sacred drama, not just this theological concept. Our focus is not simply on myth as story, but on myth as ritual, as a repeated symbolic act through which cultures confront questions of order and chaos, identity and otherness, and beginning and end. We're going to examine how tales of giant slaying, final battles, witchcraft, and the reuse of pagan sites and stories function as ritual instruments of both memory and transformation in Christianized Europe. As we have a number of times, we'll begin with the topic of chaos. Across pre-Christian and Christian traditions, myths involve giants and monstrous foes, serve as this dramatic symbol of cosmic disorder. In these stories, the slaying of a giant or beast does not simply remove a threat, it reestablishes cosmic and moral order. We've seen that a bunch of different times in previous examples from other time periods and other geographic cultures. In Norse myth, giants or the Juntar are forces of primordial chaos. Of course, we see that same idea in the Greek ideas, these primordial, very old entities. In this case, the eventual confrontation with the gods at Ragnarok signals the end and rebirth of the world. In Christianized stories, dragons and monstrous beings become stand-in for sin, heresy, and the devil. So, I'm going to be clear on this, as they become Christianized, they take their stories and they allegorize their traditions with a spiritualized version of biblical accounts. Remember that they're getting pieces of them. Some priests and things may have had entire Bibles, but people didn't. So taking these things and everything's being reinterpreted. This destruction by saints or heroes becomes an allegory of divine triumph. So when we teach hermeneutics, of course, we teach allegorical interpretation is bad. Yes, there's allegory in the Bible, but you interpret the allegory the way it was intended to be interpreted. Okay. Also not a hermeneutics class, but just to be clear, we interpret the Bible based on the context, language, and history of its time period. So not like it was written in 1950, not like it was written in 1450. Carlos Steele puts this entire idea into plain language. Christianity adopted the forms of pagan myth, not in order to suppress them, but to appropriate their symbolic power. We do this as missionaries. We'll go into a location and we don't try to make them American Christians. Well, that's what used to happen lots of times. Or we don't try to make them something they're not, but we'll use their language and some of their cultural ideas to explain the gospel. So that's what's really taking place here. And they're really confused, especially with things like the book of Revelation. They're many times doing these hyper allegorical understandings of the book of Revelation, getting some of the big picture, which is Christ returns at some point, but they're oftentimes interpreting the Bible through hermeneutics, or they're living in Revelation. It's not a specific time period, so it's called the idealistic hermeneutic of Revelation. So that they're pointing at different things and looking for the beast, who we recognize as Antichrist. They're looking for a false prophet. They're reimagining those ideas through their history and traditions. So this appropriation was not accidental. It was a ritual strategy. When a hero slays a monster, he's reenacting sacred drama. Now, I mean, just take the example of Jack and the Giant Killer, Beowulf in the Deep, or David with a sling. These figures act as more than warriors, but as agents of divine justice. So as you're reinterpreting the book of Revelation and you think you're living within that time period, you're going to look around and say, that's the beast. The person persecuting me, they must be the evil entity from the book of Revelation, or from other places, or they are Babylon. This happens in a number of different ways throughout the medieval period. The Roman Catholic Church even has something they refer to themselves as this was the Babylonian captivity. It's the church's captivity, although not the more ancient version of that. And again, not church history, not Jewish history today. We won't go into those things, but just to say these allegorical interpretations are used to prove points. Let's think about how these myths became socially ritualized through the figures of giant slayers and cultural heroes. In British lore, Jack the Giant Killer is no noble warrior. He's a clever commoner hero, and they liked those kinds of stories. We still do today. Everyone likes the underdog. He defeats giants not with brute strength, but with trickery and divine aid. His victory is one of Christian cunning over pagan power, a symbolic retelling of how faith and reason overcome brute force. In the Norse Germanic world, the Beowulf legend places its hero in liminal spaces, swamps, underwater layers, edges of civilization. These are ritual zones where ordinary rules do not apply and transformation occurs. Sarah writes, the narrative of the pagan hero persists in Christian hagiography, not erased, but baptized and redirected. So the retelling of the story is the idea. In the Christian era, these myths are not discarded, they are absorbed. St. George slays a dragon, just as Sigurd once slew Fafnir. The difference is theological. The dragon now represents sin, not a hoarded treasure. All of these heroes reflect rites of passage. They emerge from combat changed, often sanctified, and the community reenacts their stories to reaffirm social, spiritual values. Perhaps we consider Samuel 17:45. You come to me with a sword, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. Next section, moving more into eschatology, let's think about moving from individual ideas of heroism to this cosmic culmination, the myth of endings. Both Norse paganism and Christianity tell powerful stories about the end of the world. And think about the ministries and the books that are sold, all to discuss eschatology. Guilty. I have a book on eschatology. It was the first thing I wanted to study. It is probably still one of the things I spend a lot of time on within my biblical studies, considering end times eschatology. And I'm a classical dispensationalist, and that makes me probably a no-go zone for a lot of other folks out there. But maybe they can work around it, and after the eschaton, they'll realize I'm right. Anyways, I'll explain it to them on the way up. But these are not simply theological, but these are ritualistic ideas that were being considered. In Norse mythology, Ragnarök is a sacred apocalypse. And think about most of the ancient world that we've looked at really didn't have any sort of formal cosmological eschatology. They just don't. Everything is about personal eschatology and maybe slightly having a concept of a broader corporate eschatology, but more just meaning it's really just an extension of that personal eschatology applied to the next person. Within the Ragnarök idea is a sacred apocalypse. The world burns, gods and giants fall, but the ashes arise and create a new world. This story affirms the cyclical logic of time. Destruction's necessary for rebirth. In Christianity, the book of Revelation offers a different framework, not cycles, but teleology, a linear movement towards a final judgment. There's a point when we get to, then I saw a new heaven, a new earth in Revelation 21. Yet, both stories show ritual themes, fire, divine combat, moral judgment, and resurrection. Now, think about this as well. Those cultures are being Christianized, so they're gonna have adaptations to their understanding. They're really not going to have a framework for understanding the book of Revelation. Anyways, you have to study your Old Testament to understand Revelation, and you have to understand some geographical things, some cultural things that really were not part of that world. Engelbert observes there are tools of identity formation, not merely about destiny, but about meaning, agency, and justice in the present. Like I said, they're looking around their world and making observations about good and evil, right and wrong, based on their crude understanding of some passages that perhaps they even only heard once. Therefore, they're gonna have to reinterpret these things with their imagination rather than clear study of Scripture. These end-time stories are reenacted in liturgy, festivals, and popular drama. They're not passive beliefs. They are ritual performances of sacred time, reaffirming divine justice and communal hope. If the giant is a mythic enemy, the witch becomes the ritual outsider, the person marked as impure, dangerous, or spiritually transgressive. In medieval Europe, especially during times of stress, plagues, famine, war, communities often targeted pagan healers, midwives, and folk practitioners as witches. These accusations followed a ritual pattern: accusation, confession, trial, and then punishment. They functioned as sacrificial dramas designed to purge the community of perceived contamination. And by the way, the modern world thinks that this happened a whole lot more than it actually did. But when it did happen, it was, first of all, terrible. But more importantly, it demonstrates that the pagan world was still basically in effect in a couple ways. There's a there's a reality that there were these people practicing these things, like the pagan forms of healing and various things like that. But some of them were just like the midwives and things that there's nothing wrong with what they're doing, even within the Christian world. It's the pagan world that's interpreting it in that fashion. And basically it's someone receiving Christ, receiving the gospel, but still viewing the world through their pagan lenses. Campbell notes the trials themselves formed a ritual drama in which the accused was a vessel for the community's fear, guilt, and the need for renewal. Many of those accused held ritual knowledge of herbs, fertility rites, healing prayers. These practices had pre-Christian roots. Christianity rebranded them, not as sacred, but as demonic. And in many of these cases, they're right. Sorry, probably not the popular take. Some are not. Gathering herbs for health purposes is not. Some of the fertility rites and healing prayers are practices to pagan gods with demons behind those pagan names. The shift from healer to heretic was not based on practice alone, but on the source of perceived authority. According to Means, the Thunder of Lion, which was this was a ritual of social exclusion, a way of defining a group versus other. The witch was not just a criminal, she was a ritual scapegoat. And so it seems that some things appear to have come through in certain presentations of Scripture more clear than others. It's because they could understand them, and things like rejecting sorcery, that was one of them. Let's look at pagan ritual in Christian space. Despite persecution, many pagan practices were not destroyed. They were absorbed. Christianity succeeded not only by combat, but by ritual transformation of space and story. And understand, we're dealing with a church that it's basically a Catholic, Roman Catholic church, not Catholic as universal as the early church was, but a church that has been corrupted in so many ways that these things don't seem that abnormal to the day in which they're being done. Churches were built on top of Roman temples. Sacred groves were turned into monasteries. Festivals timed with solstice or equinox were repurposed as saints' days. Not a biblical practice. There are no saints' days in the Bible. In literature, we see the same strategy. The poem of St. Erkenwald, for instance, tells of a pagan Roman judge trapped in limbo until a Christian saint's compassion redeems him. As Sela explains, the poem both honors and resolves the pagan past, reclaiming its sacred value while asserting Christian grace. These are ritual acts of suppression. The church does not erase the past, it captures it, it conquers it. Urban rituals, processions, relics, parades, civic liturgies follow the contours of pagan pageantry. Pagan forms are baptized, not abolished. So what can we conclude? Christianity did not destroy paganism. It ritually transformed it. The transition from one world to another was never total. It was layered, negotiated, and encoded in ritual forms. One author wrote, Rattari notes, Christian ritual identity was forged not by negating the past, but by weaving it into a new cosmic narrative. This is in Ireland at the Edge. Even centuries later, the ritual memory of paganism endures in stone, in song, in shape of the calendars and the lines of the landscape. These layers remind us that ritual is both resilient and flexible. It can carry meaning across theological shifts. It can preserve memory even when doctrine changes. Engelbert warns, religious affiliations were not fixed identities. They were ritual, situational, and often negotiated at the level of community. The sacred does not vanish. It mutates, it remembers, it resurfaces. The stories of giants, dragons, witches, and end times are not relics. They are ritual expressions of humanity's deepest fears and hopes, narratives through which communities confront chaos, define belonging, and envision redemption. As students of history and religion, we are not just decoding myths, we are tracing the ritual pathways by which worlds are remade. Now, I want to encourage you, make sure in this lecture and the previous lecture, make sure you examine your provided notes. They'll be important to you as well because they have more detailed explanation of both of these sets of materials. So with that, if there's anything I can do for you, please let me know. And may the Lord bless your studies.